This is a video about how to actually enjoy poetry. I find that a lot of students, if I ask them to give me their honest opinion about poetry, a handful of them really love poetry and are excited, but many students feel like poems are some sort of riddle that has to be unlocked and like there's only one answer. Then on the flip side, a lot of students feel like poems are really subjective, very esoteric, and almost like any answer goes. So what's the point in studying a poem? I think it's helpful to admit that we don't always like every poem that we read, and we might not respond to or even understand every poem that we read. In this course, I'm trying to give you a wide variety of poems, but many of the poems that we're reading are not poems that I necessarily find all that moving or powerful, but they're representative of a certain technique, or they teach something really well, or they use figurative language in a way that lends itself to discussion. So I hope you find at least one poem this semester that appeals to you. When you're reading poems, you want to read in your authentic voice. So I think sometimes people think that they have to read poetry as if they are in a coffee house, or they have to read poetry like an English teacher or a creative writing professor. I think it's helpful to read the poems out loud. After all, poetry is an oral tradition, but to read it in your voice. Now, I do think reading the poem slowly helps, and you can really hear the words as they leave your mouth, but read it in your own authentic voice. Notice how the form connects to content. So as you're reading a poem, even if it's not doing it for you, if you're not really moved by the poem, or if you're not really intellectually stimulated by the poem, you might, just as an exercise, notice how the technical elements or the form of the poem is somehow connected to the theme or the content of the poem. That's one thing that I can always appreciate about a good poem, that connection between form and content. How a line is skipped, or how there's enjambment or an end-stopped line, not just because, but because of some purpose. It connects to the overall content or the overall meaning of the poem. Noticing the technical skill of the poet. There are all sorts of literary devices and figurative language terms that I've given you in a previous lecture. So be aware of those terms as you read. If you feel like a discussion is getting a little bit too slippery or a little bit too abstract, you can look for concrete examples of figurative language. Appreciate the poem as a historical document. So one thing I think is really helpful is to think about how the poem is a snapshot in time. So if you are reading, say, a Renaissance sonnet, you might not necessarily appreciate the sonnet itself, but you will learn a lot about the history of the time period. You will learn a lot about politics of the time period and Queen Elizabeth and the court. So try to appreciate the time period or the genre. When we're reading Romantic era poetry, you will learn a lot about what artists and writers and just thinkers were pondering as they moved back to nature and tried to appreciate nature, invention, and imagination, and they were responding to reason and rationality of the Enlightenment. Appreciate imagery. For example, in the poem A Display of Mackerel, which is one of my favorite poems, I think what I like even more than the theme of the poem, about individuality being kind of overrated, and working in unity and working as a team being really much more important and much more beautiful. I love the imagery. I love the imagery of shimmering and the abalone shell. I can really see the fish, the mackerel lined up in the market. So appreciate just the images in the poem. Try word replacement. This is a strategy we'll use a lot this semester. We'll ask you to take out a word or a couple of words and replace it with a synonym and see how the meaning would change. Let's say the word in the poem is bog. How would it change? How would the meaning of the poem or the sound changed if you changed it to a synonym like quagmire or swamp? Connect the themes to your own experiences, right? So poetry is supposed to be an emotional experience, or reading poetry is supposed to be an emotional experience. So connect it to your own life and to your own experiences, and of course to other texts, to other poems, to short stories you've read, to novels, or to just big ideas that people have been thinking about for hundreds of years. Allow yourself to not get a poem. I know that can be difficult in an English class, and these are really tips on just enjoyment of the poem rather than, say, writing about the poem or close reading the poem. But it's okay if you encounter a poem in the wild or even in this class and you don't get every single part of the poem. That's okay. Now, in this class, I want to make sure that you have a working understanding of the poem. So let me know if there's something that's not making sense to you. But you don't need to treat every poem as if it's a riddle that has a single answer and must be unlocked. I think that can be fun for a lot of poems, and a lot of readers enjoy that part of poetry. But some poems are not simply riddles. Poems tend to be much more complex than that. So try to get out of that mindset. You don't necessarily have to crack the poem. Research the poem and find literary criticism on the databases. So use the Pierce College Library databases, especially the literary analysis ones, and see what critics have written about the poem. Oftentimes I will read a poem and I'll just think, I don't get it. Everyone says that this is a brilliant poem or a really important poem, but to me it seems really corny, or it seems really simplistic, or it seems overly complicated. But then when I read what a professional critic has said about the poem, I start to appreciate it much more. So try that. And then, of course, look for poetry outside of anthologies or outside of this class. So we have what's called the canon. This means the poems that are taught over and over again. And of course, it's constantly changing, as it should. That's a good thing. But the poems and the texts that are taught over and over again and that are considered really important. But look outside of that for poems that you want to read for your own pleasure. Songs, of course, as you know, songs are poems. Spoken word poems, murals, even Instagram has its own poetry. In fact, I've included a poem right here from an Instagram poet. So try to think outside of anthologies when you're reading poetry for pleasure. And remember, just because you don't like a selection of poems for one particular class does not mean that you're not a poetry person. Just like how a lot of students will say, I'm not a reader, I don't read novels, but I say, well, do you read nonfiction? And they say, oh yeah, I read tons of nonfiction. Well, they're readers, right? They just don't like novels. They prefer to read a historical document or an op-ed or something like that. Give yourself a chance to like poetry by reading a variety of poetry. I hope these tips have helped.